In the dusty, sun-scorched town of Silver Creek, life moved slowly but with a sharp edge. The rough frontier was not for the faint-hearted. It was a place where the wind howled like a wolf at night. The roads were lined with dry brush and the people were as tough as the land they lived on. Among the residents was Jake Callahan, a seasoned cowboy who had spent more time riding the open range than in any town. He was known for his quiet strength and the way he could handle a horse, a rifle, or a fistfight without flinching. But there was one thing about Silver Creek that always puzzled Jake: the Apache sisters. The two women had arrived in Silver Creek under mysterious circumstances. No one seemed to know much about them. Some whispered that they were daughters of a powerful Apache chief, while others believed they had escaped from a dangerous band of warriors. The truth was elusive and the town was full of rumors. Sierra, the older sister, was tall and graceful with striking features. She had an air of mystery around her, a calm and quiet presence that seemed to put people on edge. Tasha, the younger sister, was just as captivating but in a more subtle way. Her eyes always seemed to be watching, calculating, and observing everything around her. Jake had noticed the sisters the first time they walked into the saloon. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the only sounds were the soft murmurs of conversation and the clink of glasses. The two women had entered without making a scene, their eyes scanning the room, taking everything in. They had sat in a corner away from the crowd, speaking in low voices to each other. It didn't take long for Jake to notice the way the townspeople reacted to them. The men, in particular, seemed to keep their distance, almost as if they were afraid to approach. The women had a reputation for being standoffish, and most people respected that boundary. Jake was used to the quiet life, but there was something different about the sisters that caught his attention. He found himself watching them more than he should have, wondering what their purpose was in Silver Creek. They didn't seem to be the kind of people who would settle in a town like this without a reason. His gut told him there was more to them than met the eye, but he couldn't put his finger on it. One evening, after a long day of working cattle, Jake wandered into the saloon to grab a drink. The usual crowd was there, but tonight felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, as if something was about to happen. As Jake leaned against the bar, his eyes once again found their way to the Apache sisters. They were sitting at their usual spot, but this time, they weren't speaking to each other. Instead, they were staring into their drinks, their faces unreadable. Curiosity gnawed at Jake. He had always trusted his instincts, and tonight they were telling him something was off. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, keeping an eye on the sisters. He wasn't sure what had sparked his interest, but it was more than just their beauty or their air of mystery. It was the way they carried themselves, the way they seemed to know more than they let on. As the night went on, the saloon grew louder. The usual group of miners and ranchers were deep in conversation, swapping stories and laughs. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He saw Tasha glance toward the door, her eyes scanning the room before quickly moving to her sister. It was a subtle movement, but it didn't go unnoticed by Jake. He watched as the two women exchanged a few quiet words, their heads close together, their voices so low that even the man sitting next to them couldn't hear. Jake wasn't the type to eavesdrop, but tonight, something told him that he needed to listen in. He couldn't help but wonder if the sisters were talking about him. He had become an object of curiosity for them, just as they were for him. The tension between them seemed to be building, and Jake wasn't sure if it was out of fear, suspicion, or something else entirely. In a split-second decision, Jake chose to take a chance. He knew the sisters were unlikely to speak openly in front of everyone, but he had an idea. Slowly, he stood up from his stool and made his way toward a table near the back of the saloon. The room was busy, with people laughing and shouting over each other, but Jake's mind was fixed solely on the Apache sisters. He sat down in a corner, leaning back in his chair and making himself as comfortable as possible. He made a conscious effort to look like he had too much to drink, slouching in his seat and closing his eyes, pretending to doze off. Jake's heart beat a little faster as he waited, hoping his ruse would work. He knew the sisters would think he was just another cowboy who had drunk too much, but that was exactly what he wanted. He had to be as invisible as possible, blending in with the noise of the room. He focused on the sounds around him, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the shuffle of boots on the wooden floor, hoping to cover up his presence. The sisters didn't seem to notice at first. They were still speaking in hushed tones, their conversation growing more intense. Jake strained to hear every word, his mind racing. He caught snippets of their conversation, but they were too quiet, too careful with their words. Still, Jake could make out a few phrases that caught his attention. "He's here." Tasha's voice was barely audible, but Jake caught the hint of concern in her tone. "We need to move quickly. There's no more time." Sierra responded with a calm, almost reassuring tone, though Jake could hear the underlying tension in her voice. "We have no choice. It's now or never." Jake's curiosity reached a boiling point. What were they talking about? Who were they trying to move against? And why did they think he knew something? The more he listened, the more questions flooded his mind. The sisters weren't just here for some casual visit. They had a purpose in Silver Creek, and whatever it was, it had to do with him. As Jake sat there, pretending to sleep, the room around him continued its usual rhythm. But inside his mind, everything had changed. The Apache sisters were planning something, and they had been watching him closely. The question wasn't just what they wanted, but what he had gotten himself into. The moment the sisters had entered Silver Creek, the entire town had unknowingly become part of something much larger, something that Jake was now tangled in. Jake's heart raced as he realized this wasn't just about survival on the frontier anymore. It was about something far deeper, and he had to decide if he would step up or remain a bystander. He had no idea how this would unfold, but one thing was certain: Silver Creek would never be the same. As Jake sat in the dark corner of the saloon, pretending to be asleep, his mind raced. The conversation between the Apache sisters had made him more curious than ever. The sisters weren't just two women passing through Silver Creek. They were here for something. And Jake had unwittingly become a part of it. Every word they had spoken seemed to carry weight, a sense of urgency. It was clear that something big was unfolding, and whatever it was, it involved him. The sound of the saloon grew louder as more men crowded in, all eager for their nightly drinks and gossip. But Jake's focus never left the two sisters. They were still speaking in low voices, but he could feel their words cutting through the noise of the room, reaching him like whispers from the shadows. They were speaking about something hidden, something they needed to find or protect. It was as though Silver Creek was just a small piece of a larger puzzle that Jake hadn't even begun to understand. Tasha's voice rose slightly, but just enough for Jake to catch a few words. "It's not safe anymore. We've stayed too long, and they're closing in on us." Sierra responded with a calmness that struck Jake. Her voice was steady, but the undertone of worry was unmistakable. "Patience, Tasha. We must wait for the right moment. If we act too soon, it could all fall apart." Jake's heart pounded as he listened. The urgency in their conversation was clear. They weren't just trying to keep a low profile, they were on the run. But from what? From whom? And how was he involved in all of this? It seemed that the longer he listened, the more questions he had. He had no idea how deep this story went. But his gut told him that if he didn't learn the truth, he would regret it. As the evening wore on, Jake tried to focus on his surroundings, pretending to still be half drunk. He watched the sisters out of the corner of his eye, noticing how they both kept glancing around the room as if searching for something or someone. They were always aware of their surroundings, always watching. It made Jake uneasy. For all their beauty, there was a sharpness to them, a sense that they knew things most people didn't. Suddenly, the door to the saloon slammed open, and the sound of boots hitting the wooden floor grew louder. A group of rough men had entered, laughing boisterously. They were loud, drunk, and looking for trouble. The men were known troublemakers, and their presence only added to the tension that already hung in the air. Jake noticed that the sisters stiffened as the men walked in, their eyes narrowing, but they said nothing. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, made his way to the bar, his eyes scanning the room. His gaze briefly met Jake's, and for a moment, it felt like the world around them froze. There was a flicker of recognition in the scarred man's eyes, a brief flash of something Jake couldn't quite place, but it was enough to make him uneasy. Jake's instincts told him that something was about to happen. These men weren't just here to drink and have a good time. They were after something, something the sisters had or something they knew. The scarred man turned to his companions and began speaking in low tones, his voice rough and menacing. Jake couldn't make out all of the words, but he caught a few phrases that made his blood run cold. "They're here. We need to find them," the man said. Jake's eyes widened. The men were looking for the sisters. But why? What could they possibly want with them? He had to find out, and fast. The sisters, now fully aware of the men's presence, stood up from their table. Jake watched as they moved with quiet precision, their eyes scanning the room one last time. They were preparing to leave, but it wasn't clear if they were running or if they had a plan. Jake felt a strange pull in his chest, as though he needed to help them. He didn't know why, but something told him that his future was tied to theirs in ways he couldn't yet understand. As the sisters made their way toward the door, Jake stood up, deciding to follow. He had no plan, no idea what he was walking into, but he knew that this was the moment. This was when everything would change. He moved quickly, stepping outside just in time to see the sisters slip into the shadows of the alley behind the saloon. Jake followed them, careful not to make a sound. He knew the men would be looking for them soon, and if he didn't act fast, the sisters would be gone and he might never learn the truth. The alley was dark and narrow, and the sound of footsteps echoed off the walls. Jake kept his distance, staying out of sight but close enough to hear the sisters' conversation. They had stopped near the back of the saloon, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of fear in their eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. "We can't keep running," Tasha whispered urgently. "They're getting closer. Every day they get closer." Sierra's voice was low but calm. "I know, but we can't let them catch us, not yet. We need more time." Jake's heart raced. They were being hunted, and the men inside the saloon were only the beginning. But why? What could the sisters possibly be hiding that was so important? And how did Jake fit into all of this? Before he could ask himself more questions, the sound of footsteps approached. The sisters quickly turned toward the sound, their hands moving to their belts. Jake instinctively crouched lower, trying to stay hidden. The last thing he wanted was to be caught in the middle of this. But as he watched, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary chase. The footsteps grew louder, and then a shadow fell across the alley. It was one of the men from the saloon. He was tall, with a menacing look on his face, and he was carrying a rifle. Jake held his breath, hoping the man wouldn't notice him. "Where are they?" The man barked, his voice rough. "I know they're here." Jake's eyes darted to the sisters. They had made no move to run, but the look on their faces was enough to tell him they were prepared for a fight. This wasn't just about hiding anymore. They had a plan, and they were ready to face whoever came for them. "We're not afraid of you," Sierra said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "You won't find what you're looking for." The man laughed bitterly. "You think I'm the one looking for something? We're all looking for the same thing, lady, and you're going to help us find it." Jake couldn't hold back anymore. He stepped out from the shadows, his hand resting on the revolver at his side. "That's enough," he said firmly. "You've got no right to be threatening these women." The man turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw Jake standing there. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, sizing each other up, but Jake wasn't backing down. He had made a choice, and he wasn't going to let the sisters face whatever danger was coming alone. The man sneered. "You think you can stop me, cowboy?" Jake's grip tightened on his revolver. "I'm not trying to stop you. I'm just making sure you don't hurt anyone." The standoff stretched on, the tension thick in the air. For a long moment, it seemed like the world had stopped moving. Then, without warning, the man took a step forward, his hand reaching for his weapon. Jake's instincts kicked in. The next few seconds felt like a blur. He drew his gun, aiming for the man's hand. A shot rang out, and the man dropped his weapon, his eyes wide in surprise. He didn't expect Jake to be so quick. "Get out of here," Jake said coldly, his voice low. "And don't come back." The man hesitated for a moment, then turned and fled into the night, leaving the alley in silence. Jake lowered his gun and turned to the sisters. Their eyes were wide with surprise, but there was a flicker of something else. Gratitude, maybe. They didn't say anything at first, but Jake could see the weight of the moment in their expressions. "We owe you one, cowboy," Sierra finally said, her voice soft but sincere. Jake nodded, the gravity of the situation settling over him. He didn't know where this story would lead, but one thing was clear. He was now a part of their journey. And from here on out, there was no turning back.